and welcome to the Bard Graduate Center. This is the first time I'm presenting a program. I'm very excited about it. My name is Mary Ann LaMonica, and I'm the Chief Curator over at the Gallery. And the program tonight is being presented in conjunction with the exhibition Water Weavers, the River in Contemporary Colombian Visual Material Culture. So this is a really interesting program and a way to connect the themes of the exhibition with contemporary thought that's going on today, contemporary art, and some of the challenges that we face as citizens of our very fragile planet. And I want to say that the program, tonight's program, was thought about, developed by our head of education, Rebecca Allen, who's sitting over there, when she attended the conference at the University of Indiana last January, called Rivers of the Anthropocene. And Charles and Mary were there, and she thought this would be a wonderful way to connect all of these things to our program. So, as we all know, and I'm sure you're here for this reason, that our world's rivers and streams and lakes and oceans are all increasingly under stress due to human activity. And we face many challenges in that regard. So tonight's program invites the perspective of an artist, of a journalist, and of a scientist to talk about some of the issues that they face in their own work, and how we can learn from their practice. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce the program, and I'm going to introduce our guests in the order in which they will speak. So we'll have a presentation by Mary Miss, another presentation by Charles Vörösmarty, and then they will come to the front and sit down with Andrew Revkin and have a conversation about the works. So I'm sure everyone here knows that Mary Miss has been a long-time artist and based in here in New York City, and currently directs a project called The City as a Living Laboratory. Her most recent work, called Flow, which opened, I guess, about 3 years ago, Indianapolis, it looks at the White River and the water system in that city. She has done many, many important projects and has been gifted in so many ways, has gifted us with her work in so many ways, and she has been the recipient of numerous awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship and the Gold Medal of Honor for the AIA, which I forget how you say this name, the Association of American Associate of Architects. Thank you. I should have written it out rather than with my initials. And Mary has been a speaker here before, so thank you for coming back, and we welcome you here tonight. Charles Vörösmarty is a professor also here in New York City at City University in civil engineering, and is the director of CUNY's Environmental Crossroads Initiative. His research focuses on the development of computer models and geospatial data sets used in synthesis studies of the interactions among the water cycle, climate, and anthropogenic activities. And finally, Andrew Revkin, who is a scientist, science and environmental writer, primarily for the New York Times, but also in his own right and as an author on his own blog called .earth, and is a senior fellow at Pace University in environmental understandings. And as we discussed a little while ago, also has a career in music, and his songs, some of which are celebrations, one that I listened to online today, called Breakneck Ridge, which is a celebration of the Hudson River, and another, which is quite funny, which is called Liberated Carbon, which has a chorus that repeats, "Liberate some carbon, it's the American way." And you can find this online, and he has a CD called A Very Fine Line. And even though that's a nice way to end, and we should all be smiling and giggling, but I think tonight's program will let us all think about very serious things, but also encounter the work of all of our guests tonight who have enlightened us about the challenges that we face. So thank you all for being here, our guests, and all of you, our audience. May I just say one thing, just a matter of course, please turn off your cell phones or put them on vibrate. And I just want to say that next week, on June 26th, next Thursday, we have a program with Jose Roca and another artist Jose Roca was the curator of the exhibition. So it should be an interesting program, and we hope you'll come back for that as well. Thank you. So may I invite Mary to come up? Do I need to do anything here, Rebecca, with the computer?
No, not at all, but we can maybe lower the lights if you want a little more darkness on the screen. Let's just try that. Do you have enough light?
Yeah,
Mary,
it's really a pleasure to find this topic being the subject of an exhibition. I'm really interested in how artists can communicate issues of water. And I'm going to show you some of the projects I've been working on recently and historically. This was a project that was done at the South Cove along the river, just above Battery Park City, and just north of the Jewish Heritage Museum. And it was done in the mid-'80s. And I've been living in Lower Manhattan in what is now called Tribeca for a very long time, and had the frustration of not being able to get to the water's edge. I came here as a young artist in the late 60s, and actually one of the first pieces I did in New York was out on Ward's Island in the East River, and I attached heavy rope that was painted white so that you could see it to a rock, pulled it taut and staked it for about a half mile, repeating over and over again along the whole south coast of Ward's Island. I had moved here from the west and got to this island and was just shocked that you really couldn't get to it in the late 60s, couldn't get to the water's edge. So it was kind of a statement about how the land and the water might be connected again. So here was a chance for me to do a project where I could actually start to bring people closer to the water. And it was one of the first projects that allowed people to enjoy the water's edge. This was part of the Battery Park City development. I arrived and found that this whole edge that we're looking at here, this hard edge, was a relieving platform with water going back underneath about 20 feet. So I immediately wanted to know how I could take that apart. And expense made us only able to do it at the south end. But I wanted to see how many ways I could get people to be able to experience the water. So as you're standing there, you can walk over a bridge that gives you the sense of getting out into the water, as well as this jetty that goes out, so that it's not only the yacht owners that get to experience the water of the Hudson, but just walking out on this curved jetty. And there was this, now of course we see a wall of buildings behind this, but it was really great in the beginning to see the project in relationship to the city. And really, I was thinking about how you could get people from the density of Wall Street and of Lower Manhattan and give them a front porch, give them a sense of the water. One of the things that happens with this is that the water comes up and down, of course, as the tide changes. And if you're a regular, people who run or happen to live in this area, you really become aware of that movement of the water. I always think of New Yorkers as people who don't believe nature exists until maybe Sandy and a few things like that start happening. And I wanted to find ways to kind of make this apparent as an island. So sometimes these pile caps are covered up. Also, there's a wonderful sound as the water kind of sucks in and out. I love the old piers as I would drive up and down the West Side Highway. And actually, we put the piers in place as this way to kind of, as I saw it, stitch the land and water together visually. So it was really this attempt as an artist to begin to give people an experience of water in the city, let them know that they're on an island. There's a walkway at the north end that you're seeing in the distance, and actually that's underwater at a high tide, or even if it's not a high tide, your feet get wet if there's a boat going by. But I kept trying to imagine how things like this could be done, where artists could really help communicate something about these natural systems around us. And I thought, this is great. I got to build this wonderful project along the edge of the Hudson River, and that's what my future is going to be. It turns out that that was like a really lucky situation, that you get commissioned to do something and the money is not used up by the engineers or somebody else. So I went on to do a number of proposals over the years along a half-mile walkway in one city and a water treatment plant in another, and they would always get canceled at the last minute, and because of money, of course. So I really started thinking about how could there be a framework that would I could go around and talk about with cities that presented artists as people who could really help communicate the issues that cities are facing. And so I developed with a colleague of mine, Marta Kern, a framework called City as Living Laboratory, Sustainability Made Tangible Through the Arts. And what I was really imagining is how artists, and meaning by artists, I take that word in the broadest sense, poets, musicians, all kinds of artists, could work on issues of social, economic, or environmental sustainability through collaborations. The thing that had really interested me as I was working on projects over the years was the kind of dialogues that I was having with people in other fields. So I said, let's imagine this framework, and we'll go around, and this is kind of an extended document, and it says, look, we can look at issues that may take 30 years to accomplish, cleaning the air a certain amount. Within a very short period of time, you could have artists actually go out and do projects that talk about that, so that that could actually happen in 30 years. There was an example of what I was thinking about with a project I did for an exhibition called Weather Report, Art and Climate Change, that Lucy Lepard organized in Boulder, Colorado in 2006 or 7, something like that. And I grew up part of my youth in Colorado and knew that flooding was really a big issue, although it doesn't occur to people that a place like Colorado would have that issue. Boulder's at the mouth of a canyon, and flash floods I knew occurred. So I started talking with some scientists, a geomorphologist and a scientist hydrologist at the USGS, and said, okay, so what's the likelihood of flooding happening in Boulder? And they said, well, as a matter of fact, this is one of the highest hazard flood zones in the western United States, and there are 147, rainstorms in the Rockies in this area every summer, and it will take one at the top of Boulder Canyon to have a devastating flood. And so we saw what the extent of the flood was, and I worked with them to, actually map the flood three-dimensionally through a series of 300 modest 6-inch diameter blue markers that we put up on trees and on buildings. And as you move through the city, sometimes these markers were only ankle high, and sometimes they were 18 feet up in the air. They remained a constant, but you really measured that flood in terms of your own body. And somehow this thing that was hard, it's so hard to get people to imagine something they haven't experienced before. or haven't seen themselves. That kind of direct effect that something in person has, as opposed to being told about an event that could happen. So this was, of course, preceding by several years the floods that happened last fall in Boulder that were devastating to the town. And it was interesting for me to go back to the people I had worked with and said, what effect did the project have? And we didn't have a kind of maybe NSF validated kind of assessment, but the people at the USGS felt that it had really been effective in bringing people's awareness, city workers, people responding to what the city workers had to say when they were trying to get people to evacuate. The really sad thing about this is that this was not the storm that they're really worried about. The storm was only over the city itself. It wasn't at the top of this canyon, which would have meant that it was much more devastating. But it was kind of strange to have done something that was preceding an event like this. But as I went around, I said, let me go into city departments of planning or talk about this city as living laboratory and get people really interested in the idea of artists being an important asset. And let me just say that as an aside, I've spent my career doing percent for art projects, and those are federal, county, state projects where 1% or 0.5% of a building project is dedicated to an artwork. Well, I think that you get the idea of how the artist is valued by the percentage that they're getting. And it's really been so difficult over the years to be in this position of being selected for a building where there's a really nice traffic island in front of it, and you try and go in and do something that's compelling and interesting. After 9/11, I lived downtown close to the World Trade Center. My assistants and I, being traumatized after cleaning our, the loft out, tried to propose a project where temporary barriers were going to replace the police sawhorses, and it would have allowed people to come and leave flowers around the perimeter of the site during the time that rebuilding was happening. And I was really interested in how people would be able to come to the site not as voyeurs, but as mourners. So I have to say that project was like a really important pivot point for me of reconsidering what I was going to do. And that's what really led to this City as Living Lab idea. I thought, I want to be able to work in my own city on issues that I'm interested in, or in other cities on things that are really of importance to me. But people were not really getting it when I just came in with my booklet outlining how this could be happening. So I was invited to do a project in Indianapolis, where I spent a good bit of time working on a project that did not happen because the budget was cut. And the Indianapolis Museum of Art said, look, we've canceled your project 3 times now. Please come back again and do something. And I thought, I don't know if I want to go back again. But I thought, okay, here's a chance for me to test this idea, to do a precedent so that people will have some sense of what it is I'm trying to do, what I'm talking about when I'm saying that artists can be a true asset to a community and not just that 0.5% value. So in my time in Indianapolis, I'd really become aware of the White River. And this is an image showing the watershed of the river. I've got this long time interest in water. And the thing about this is that when Indianapolis was settled, I think the forefathers, and I think I've got it right there in calling them the fathers, arrived in the springtime, thought it was a navigable river, and found out much later, or the next summer, that it was in fact not navigable. So the river's not built up like Cleveland or Chicago or any other city where you have the bustling waterfront or derelict waterfront. there's a downtown area where factories would use the water or put the trash into the water, but otherwise it's very bucolic, lovely looking stream that is in fact terribly polluted by farms and industry up above. So here we are in New York City with our water coming from these pristine reservoirs, more or less, into the city. They're taking their 70% of their water, terribly polluted water, and drinking that water after it's been purified. So I said, how could we make this place visible, this water body, this system visible to people? And I knew that I'd already been through the experience enough times to know that I did not want to do a spectacle, large-scale project that was going to cost so much money that it would be canceled again. And I said, how can I do something that's almost like acupuncture? How can I decode the landscape and the edge of the river in a 6-mile stretch? So just to go back one, the museum itself is up at that bend in the river where you see a lake that it's surrounding, and the center of town is down at the bottom here where the red dots end. So I decided to look at this 6-mile stretch of river and try and take people along that and show them pieces of this bit by bit. So I came up with a way of taking something almost like a Google map pin that you see in the landscape there, a 6-inch diameter sphere, and on the surface of a mirror, I put a red mark. And what happened is that you could place that sphere wherever you wanted people to have their attention drawn, and then when you looked in the mirror, you not only saw yourself in relationship to the river, but you could align those marks and read and see named what it is that you're looking at. So that this process of, as I said, decoding the landscape was repeated at 100 sites in this 6-mile stretch of along the river. And there was a number that you could dial up and hear something more. At the very least, you had what you were looking at named, that you were standing on a levee or next to a fish hatchery or at a historic site where there had been an encampment. But also on the back side, it showed you where you were along that 6-mile stretch. So you have the dial-up number there where you hear a short, like 1-minute description. There's a website that you could go to if you wanted more information. And then every once in a while, we had a map on a glass disc that told about the project. So these are just examples of some of the things that we were looking at. At the museum itself, in the atrium, we had this 40-foot square map. We had a tagline for the project that was also on the mirrors. All property is riverfront property. The river starts at your front door. So this really allowed people to see where they were in relationship to the river and, you know, walk that distance and, you know, see their own home. But we received, and again, let me say that I'm collaborating on this project with people at Indiana University, Purdue University, Butler, Marion University. So I had a lot of help from the scientists, what we were going to look at in the project. And with Tim Carter at Butler University, we applied for a NOAA grant, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and got a grant to build an app that allowed you to track a raindrop any place in the city to the river itself. And it was really a kind of, it is a remarkable kind of device or app. It's a web-based app. It's still in operation. But if you see that you can choose between a normal storm or a very heavy storm, and the water flows differently depending on that. If the line is green, it's going through an open channel. If it's purple, it's going through a pipe. The question marks on the line itself show, if you click on those, you find out what's polluting this particular stretch of river. I was pretty amazed that the city had all of this documented. I don't think in New York City you could even do something like this. There was also a place that you could go and find out the difference between weather and climate. You could find out what you could do as an individual to help clean the water up. In addition to that, we had a series of events at the time the project opened, where there were, this is great, thank you. There were talks, there were performances, dance performances, a parade with the local community. Thank you. But when we did this project, we talked about it being catalytic. And it's really, those are nice words that an artist can say. I really hope this is going to, this project will be catalytic rather than a thing in itself, rather than being, a major installation that everybody's paid, zillions of dollars for. And you never know what's going to happen with that. But subsequently, a group of community associations got together and formed a committee called Reconnecting with Our Waterways. And with Tim Carter, the scientist from Butler University, in the lead, we received a grant for $3 million from the National Science Foundation's program for advancing STEM learning, informal STEM learning. And we're in the process now of implementing a project on 6 tributaries to the river. So they're in very different communities, mostly poor communities, and it's really such an interesting thing to be able to stay in this same city and take this project forward. We've learned so much about what's working and not working. For instance, that great app that we did, trackaraindrop.org, only people who are interested in water were using it. One of the things we learned is that you really need to draw people in at different levels in different ways. So events are really an important way. We've been working on a project here in New York where we're looking at another kind of corridor, the corridor of Broadway, and trying to imagine it as a green corridor of the city. And in this case, we're still experimenting and finding out that if you go out with artists and scientists to have walks and talks in the community, that's really interesting. We worked recently with a game designer, and we know that walks are interesting, and some people will use those. Dial-ups are interesting, and a few people will use those. But in this recent experiment we did, we developed a series of prompts that we handed out to a group of people who had congregated on Jane's Walks Day, which is the first weekend in May. And the prompts asked them to look at different things about the environment and things that they had to seek out. For instance, one of the prompts was to follow a raindrop from where you're standing to where you think it will last see the light of day. And one group photographed a storm drain in the street. Another went down into the subway and photographed a drain. A more adventuresome group went into the nearest bar and photographed the urinal in the men's room. And it was just really interesting to see people engaging, not just listening. It's kind of like that thing of being able to measure the flood water against your own body. It's so much different if you're asked to go out and seek out, experience the thing directly. So when I started this project, City as Living Laboratory, I think that I really got the right word when I used the word laboratory, because it's really a series of tests about what works and doesn't work. So I'm really excited now about this, how we're building on the work that was initially done in Indianapolis, and coming up with a way to kind of layer in experience, build in experience to these sites. Just one more project I want to show you very briefly is something that was done in Long Island City. The Noguchi Museum asked 3 artists to come in and imagine this district around the museum as a place other than what a developer might turn it into. And the thing that I thought would be really great would be to make this district into what I called a research district, but innovation zone, a place where artists and scientists could test projects. I know as I've been working on my Broadway initiative, it's, you know, knocking on every door over and over again, DOT, city planning, parks, having to wend your way through the city bureaucracy. Here in this district that I'm kind of imagining, artists would be protected by a cultural trust that could run interference for them and get the permissions and allow people to test things that otherwise might not be allowed. So we wanted to do examples of the kind of thing that might happen. And something that really interested me was looking at this old creek that used to run through this Ravenswood neighborhood. And so we started in Socrates Sculpture Park by, actually we had several hundred old mirrors, and you see those gray reflections in the bottom in the ground, but those were convex mirrors that were embedded in the ground that were very reflective, that were tracing the path of Sunswick Creek that used to run here and have its mouth right on the grounds of the Socrates Sculpture Park. There are the red and white banded Big Alice stacks just looming over this neighborhood right nearby. Another project I wanted to do was to turn those stacks into kind of like the fundraising barometers, showing how well you're doing, how well the city's doing on recycling or water use or, you know, air pollution. I thought those red stacks would be great, but kind of continuing the riff on the red and white stacks, we placed a number of poles along this section, tracing the creek, and the title of the project was If Only the City Could Speak, and there were a series of speech bubbles on the grounds of the museum that gave information and a brief text about Sunswick Creek. And we worked with the writer Robert Sullivan to do these texts. So as I say, we keep learning new lessons, and in Indianapolis we had written the texts ourselves, and they were really dry, very straightforward. Sullivan wrote these very beautiful, evocative texts, brief texts, allowing people to really reimagine the creek as it is and as it used to be. After you left the grounds of the park itself, we banded a series of poles, and there was a dial-up number that you see on the ground. In this kind of example of how the city's built following the original topography, there's a weird kind of triangle area that is just where the creek runs out on the map. So it was obviously just a big marshy area, the most marshy area, and they decided not to use it, made it into this triangle. And we kind of tried to commemorate that triangle as the previous marsh by putting in here this portable piece of wetland to kind of remind people what used to be here. But I think that the thing that's really most compelling to me is thinking about how artists could have such a difference within, make such a difference. We have an ability to think and communicate in ways that others would not bother with or aren't interested in. And so I'm trying to reimagine and to help others reimagine, whether they're in city government or whether it's the artists themselves, not this peripheral 0.5% or 1% role for the artists, but how can artists be at the table and have a really kind of central voice in the culture, in shaping the issues in our cities today. So I think I should stop there and invite Charles, my favorite scientist, to come up.
I was a favorite scientist. I don't think my students would say the same. So I think we have to switch something here, right? Great.
There you are.
There we are. Okay. So first of all, thanks to Rebecca. I think she's left the room, but thanks so much for inviting me to this very interesting gathering. And I would say that the crowd that I'm addressing now is not the typical crowd that I speak to. So what I attempted to do is to give you a heavy dose of science and perhaps a bit too much of a pessimistic view of things. I will try to end on a more positive note. I am a scientist. I work in lots of facts and figures, but I also understand the intrinsic value of imagery in all of what we do as scientists. And I think that having opened a dialogue with Mary Miss and her team and other artists is very important to me as a scientist to convey some sometimes very serious and important messages, and hopefully turn the bad news into something a bit more hopeful that I think Mary was a wonderful example of here. So I start with a pretty negative title here, but that was in a sense borrowed from the title of this gathering, so Troubled Water. And I asked this simple question: are we masters of freshwater management or bulls in a china shop? So do we look something like this, cheering our way through the water crisis of the 21st century? Or do we look a bit more like that? And hopefully you'll be able to decide that at the end of about 30 minutes here. Let me make a quick pitch for what's happening uptown here on the City College campus. I was brought back to New York. I was born and raised in New York City. I was brought back after 32 years at the University of New Hampshire to begin work on a multi-campus initiative at the City University of New York. We call it the City University of New York's CUNY Environmental Crossroads Initiative. As it says there, our mission is to basically place some pretty big ticket environmental problems on the table and assemble interdisciplinary teams to try to tackle those issues. Originally, when we conceived of this idea, we were thinking of bringing scientists together with legal experts and economists and social scientists and decision makers, and now I think we could also probably put into the mix artists as well. There's certainly lots of groups that work on such big strategic environmental sustainability questions, but our particular little angle here is to use quantitative information derived from state-of-the-art technologies to really inform those kinds of discussions. So we go away from hand-waving to real facts and figures and try to bring some coherency to that dialogue. We're the 5th floor of that building on the top right there. We're joined by experts in nanotechnology and structural biochemistry and photonics and neurobiology, and we are charged with talking with each other. So I've already been talking to my colleagues in nanotechnology about how we might create environmental sensors of one type or another that could help us instrument the planet. Is there a pointer? Was there a pointer here? It would be helpful to have a pointer. Okay, so I'm gonna paint a global picture, and then as the prospectus indicated, I'm gonna be talking a little bit more about things in our neck of the woods. So I'm going to make the statement that we live on a blue planet. I think certainly you've heard that particular phrase before, and I want to put fresh water into perspective. And as any good school kid from New York City would do when asked to put something into perspective, guess what we do? We measure things against the height of the Empire State Building. Okay, so starting with all the water on that blue planet, so that's all the water in the oceans and everywhere that you could think water could reside, and you make that equivalent to the height of the Empire State Building. That's 100% of water on Earth. Can someone tell me how much vertical space is occupied by all the fresh water on the Earth? Can somebody just take a guess for me? Nobody's willing to make it. You're willing
At the
to.
very tip,
How much?
the tip, the antenna.
The antenna. Well, that's actually not such a bad guess. It's actually about 3 floors. That's all the fresh water on the Earth. Can someone tell me then how much of the accessible groundwater is on the Earth? And we use a lot of groundwater. How much? How high?
Three times that.
3 times that. It would have to be smaller because it's fresh water, fresh groundwater,
Fresh ground.
accessible groundwater.
Well, accessible, you mean like, means this is Sahara type thing.
Yeah, can we get hold of it? It's not too deep, it's not too polluted with brines, etc.
Half of that.
Half of it. Well, it's the height of a human being.
Oh,
Okay.
No.
Now, the major water resource that we depend on as humankind are river systems. That's the renewable basis for most of the water use on Earth. And there's groundwater use, but most of it is from renewable fresh water conveyed by rivers. Can someone tell me the height of the renewable main freshwater resources serving humans in rivers? Can someone take a guess?
2 stories.
2 stories. No. You have to be smaller again. And it's really small. It's the thickness of a penny. So here's my imagery. So I'm trying to convey in one image here the idea that water is abundant on planet Earth, but the stuff that we've got access to is a very, very slender little, almost paper-thin height compared to the Empire State Building. That's what we have to rely on. So it's precious and it's somewhat rare. So then the question becomes, well, how are things going for that penny? Okay, and if we step back and begin to look at the global dimensions of these problems, I'm showing here some time series. I wish I had a pointer, but okay. I could use my finger, which would be an analog
We're getting
system.
a pointer for you, Charles.
You want a cane?
I could use a cane. Fantastic. I haven't used a cane in a long time. I broke my leg, but I can see where this is being from. Okay, so we have these 100-year time series of the records of how much water has been used by humanity, how many large dams have been placed on rivers, how much inland fishing there is, how much nitrogen pollution, and invasive species. Okay, and one thing that you'll notice is that these curves are all going up. They're all century in perspective, so there's a lot of inertia building towards ever increasing use and abuse of water systems. And in this particular diagram, each of the 5 curves has a very, very dramatic impact on the nature of rivers in particular, and with often disastrous consequences on aquatic ecosystems and aquatic life. And I think if we're looking to the future, it's going to be really a difficult task to turn these upward trajectories around on a dime. It's going to take a long time. It's going to take, thank you. I guess I don't need the analog system. Thanks so much. So it's going to take a long time to turn things around, and that is, in my view, is going to be the beginning of what we're going to be facing in the 21st century. This is the 20th century here. Okay. So, no, but I'm saying this is year 2000. This goes to year 2000. This is not the future. This is the contemporary. This is our starting point into the future, into the next century. Okay, sorry, wrong direction. Okay, so one of the things that we've been trying to do, and I tilted several windmills, and one of the windmills that I've been tilting at is to try to get the global water community, which is really focused quite often on local scale problems, local scale understanding, local scale engineering, to try to just step back and say, well, what's the accumulated impact of humanity on the world's water systems? And I was able, and I'm happy to say I was honored to lead a small international team to this charge. We ultimately were able to develop a series of global maps of the state of affairs circa year 2000 with respect to the world's inland water systems. This puts us in some sense at parity with the global climate change community, which has done a fantastic job of articulating the fact that we're all connected through the climate, and it is indeed a global question. We really haven't had that capability in the water world before. So I can't go into much of the detail just because I only have a half hour, but there's a website where you can, at your heart's content, take a look at what we've done. There are all sorts of data sets and visualizations, and if you like to manipulate information, you can download it and play with that data, and several people have done this when they've seen this, this website, and I encourage you to do so. So let me dive a little bit into this. This is global, and I promise you we'll get to the regional scale. So what did we find? So what we did is we assembled a series of information sets that were developed by many of our colleagues around the scientific community. These were fully global scale data sets that depicted poor land and watershed management, pollution, overuse or maladaptive water management, and biotic stress agents like invasive species and such. And what we did is we assembled all this information. We had a scoring system. We put this together, and we came up with a first map looking at the threats to biodiversity, or for that matter, human water security. And wherever it's red, it's quite intuitive. It means there's a lot of threat, things are not going well. Wherever it's green or blue, things are much better. And we see a series of global syndromes. And the first thing that we looked at to check our work is we looked at China and India, where it's well known that the water systems are under severe stress. They're extremely polluted, poorly managed, et cetera. And we patted ourselves on the back. And then we turned our attention to Europe and the United States, where there are also these big red globs. And we say, what is going on here? And sure enough, we checked our work, and we checked it again, and we checked it again, and we decided that after all of the well-prepared environmental laws and regulations and an educated population and the technological wherewithal to prevent problems from arising, we tend to, as a simple byproduct of development, you might say sloppy development, impair the very water systems that we depend on. Okay? These are very regionally specific. If you notice, here's China, here's Southeast Asia. Look at the contrast between Thailand and Laos, and this is a really sharp difference in terms of the level of development in these two countries. And it's, in our view, a simple byproduct of development and not being careful in how you develop, and the byproducts of this development cascade into these water systems. And this is the picture that we see circa year 2000. And even rich countries are similarly under the gun here. Okay, but then there's a really interesting facet to all of this. Here are two views of planet Earth circa 2000. And for water systems, we ask the question, where is it safest to live on the planet? Okay, and if you're aquatic organism, you're fish or crustacean or plant, maybe bacterium if you so desire, avoid places like Europe. Believe it or not, avoid places like Europe. Avoid India, of course, as we said before, but avoid Central Asia, avoid places like developed Europe, because the background level of stress as a byproduct of development is quite high. Instead, you might ask, well, where's it safest for humans? Well, green and blue is good, and that's where you go. You go to Europe. You turn the faucet on in your hotel room, and guess what? It's clean water, and it's pretty much always there. There's a lot of water security. Threats are low. Places like sub-Saharan Africa, or again India and Central Asia, are places where there's a lot of threat to human water security. And how does this all arise? Well, the way this arises is through an investment of about $750 billion a year to take this background environment of threat and to reconvert it, especially in the developed world, into safe places for human beings. Not all human beings. Poor human beings are certainly suffering. And this is at the point of delivery. This is the map after you've invested $750 billion per year to remediate this background level of threat. So you impair the system, and if you can do so, you make big investments like in concrete and pipes and water treatment plants and interbasin transfers and reservoir systems, and you remediate that threat, and you get a picture that looks like this. The kinds of things that we're talking about are really massive, massive engineering works. Here's a picture of the Hoover Dam, for example. And if you look at the planet today, just look out your airplane window next time you're going across the US or going across many other parts of the world. You'll see irrigation in very dry parts of the world, like here in Arizona. You'll see dams and reservoirs all over the place. You may not see it, but there are lots of interbasin transfers, taking water from water-rich areas and moving it to water-poor areas. There certainly are benefits and concerns, and we can have a debate about whether these are good things or bad things. They are there. They're part of the hydrology of the planet right now. But I will say that these are probably very, very costly, what you might call supply side or hard path solutions to water scarcity. And this has been the tradition of the water sector for literally a century, if not more. This has a collateral impact. Now, if we got into an argument about whether dams and reservoirs, for example, are good, you'd immediately be talking about issues of food security and whether you're going to be taking dams down in places where you might need them to feed hungry children because you can only irrigate in certain parts of the world to grow your food. We're not getting into that debate. But I would like to just simply point out that the collateral damage from this, in terms of the biodiversity, is quite astounding. And there was the word Anthropocene that was uttered in the opening remarks. And a paleontologist would rename a geological epoch, let's say from the current Holocene into the Anthropocene, based on changes in species assemblages in the sedimentary record. And I believe that the Anthropocene has come to inland aquatic ecosystems, and this graph is, in a sense, prima facie evidence of that. So what I'm showing here on these couple of axes is the number of described species as this line here, and there are 3 bars. There are only 3 bars here. The marine domain, the land domain, and the freshwater domain. And because freshwater, in terms of rivers and wetlands and lakes, are relatively rare and very, very unique environments on the planet Earth, but yet maintains lots of life, they have literally tens to hundreds of times more species per unit areas. They're so much more rich in terms of their biodiversity than the marine environment or the land environment at large. So they're very unique and very precious bank accounts of biodiversity. That's the described number. The bars here, that was a line. The bars on this axis here are the imperiled or actually lost species as best we can document it. And the biodiversity community has done a great job of trying to document this. And sure enough, following the line here, tens to hundreds of times more imperilment of these species exists in the freshwater domain than the marine or the land systems at large. And so this is a very, very important byproduct of our use of water, and maybe it's a quiet catastrophe that most people are unaware of, but nonetheless it is happening. Okay, so how should we manage our way into the future? And we could do things the hard pathway. And in fact, if you look at the blueprint of or blueprints, I should say, of the water sector, here's one example from this think tank McKinsey called Charting Our Water Future. They talk about all of this kind of hard path, supply side solutions to the water crisis. And again, it's about $750 billion a year that flows into that sector of the economy. If you look at these kinds of documents, they talk about a lot of this stuff, but they never really talk about the use of wetlands and natural systems that, in some sense, give you free public subsidies. Using wetlands, for example, in the right way, managing them correctly, helps reduce the need for building check dams for floods, for example, because that's the natural function of these systems. There are nursery grounds to enormous quantities of aquatic life, as I mentioned, and you destroy that kind of function, you've got to replace it somehow through, let's say, fish hatcheries, which are all over the place. And this kind of thinking, looking beyond the classical infrastructure, is really still pretty much in its infancy. And this is a $750 billion a year industry here. The protected areas that you could potentially use in this arena, the investments there, I've looked at some recent documents, the investments made in protecting these systems for water services are perhaps in the tens of billions of dollars merely per year. That sounds like a lot of money, but in comparison to this, it's certainly not very much. Okay, so that's a stage setting. Let me talk a little bit about our work. We have a National Science Foundation project that brings together 6 partner institutes. We look at a 13-state region from Maine down to the Middle Atlantic states near the DC area and Virginia. This particular part of the Earth, this Northeast, is a part of the Earth system. It's an environment that gives us services of one kind or another, whether it is fresh water to power our hydroelectric facilities or to cool our power stations, or to give us water for clean drinking purposes, or for supporting fisheries and the tourist industry. It's a part of the Earth system also that's populated greatly by humans. So we have all sorts of questions having to do with our energy management and our infrastructure, and we're packed with people. And we have to accommodate the needs of people, but we're also struggling to protect our environment. I'm not sure this shows up, particularly in the back of the room, but there's a loop here that reminds me to mention that I come from the world of science here, where we can do simulation models of the built environment, or the atmosphere, or aquatic ecosystems, or the land-based systems. We do carbon. We liberate and estimate liberated carbon as part of what we do for a living. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to take this really pure vision of the value of quantifying what's happening here from an Earth system perspective, and to put it into something broader. And that broader environment is first of all to figure out how these geophysical or biogeophysical fluxes that we can calculate with our simulations, how can you look at them in a different way? And the way we look at them is in terms of ecosystem services. What goods and services flow out of this part of the world's environments that could potentially be of value to humanity? How is it of potential value to humanity? We work with economists to try to actually evaluate what's flowing out of this part of the Earth system and what it does in terms of our regional economy. And armed with that kind of information, we then take this through these participatory, we call them design charrettes, we take them to stakeholders and decision makers. And we co-design scenarios that allow us then to put numbers back into these models, and then we report what the services are, what the impacts on the economy are, and we talk once again with these stakeholders, and we might decide that the first set of planning exercises were off base. Let's do something a little bit different. And the whole idea is to try to keep this flow of information going. And over the last 2 to 3 years, we've assembled about 50 groups. We assemble these teams of about a dozen people each. We talk about energy security and carbon management, food security, build-out questions, water resources and water resource infrastructure management. We learn what's on their minds, because what's on my mind as a crazy curiosity-based scientists is not always what's on the minds of real live decision makers. And this has been a very useful exercise for myself and my team. Let me share with you, we have lots of concepts we talk about with these teams. Let me talk about one concept that keeps coming up and that I'm not sure has been at least previously articulated to these teams. In particular, those stakeholders who would like to plan the future, but often don't recognize that there are legacy effects embedded in these decisions. And so I'm showing you something here that was constructed for the Chesapeake Bay region. I use it for the entire northeastern region, and it's basically here to remind us that there are decade to century legacies in terms of how humans have interacted with the environments of this region. And you could trace it back to these different periods, the pre-European settlement in, say, 1600. You look at the region, it was closed forests and indigenous management. Between 1600 and 1800, during the early settlement period, you've got widespread clearing, you have the emergence of small towns and urban centers. 1800 to 1900, you have the Industrial Revolution, then industrial urbanization. We're starting to do more modern things like fertilize our croplands, and we have industrial suburbs. Some of the forests we originally had cleared are regrown as agriculture moves to different parts of the country. And you could follow this through to the present day with modern urban sprawl. And the nature of this literally 400-year history, we see evidence for today. So decisions made back here could actually affect where our starting point would be for the future. And speaking of the future, which I guess we could call the post-industrial era, we're going to be talking about increasingly how do we manage our ecosystems at the fully regional scale? How do we cope with climate change? How do we deal with carbon management? How do we deal with aging infrastructure and making sure that the aging infrastructure doesn't damage the environment? And so these legacy effects historically are potentially going to be facing us in the future. Let me show you one or two examples of this, of particularly this legacy effect. So here's an accounting system that we developed from 1700 to the year 2000, looking at the impact, the liberation of carbon from these closed forest systems to open systems, cropland and grazing land. Okay, and as I mentioned in my little history lesson in that last slide, this has been going on for hundreds of years. And if you take stock of the amount of carbon that has been liberated, either with or without music, that's been liberated, the effect has been century scale. And this purple area here is the tabulation that we've made of the persistent emission of the same kind of carbon we're worried about from fossil fuels, but coming out of the landscape. So you clear a forest, you might burn it, you clear it for agriculture, the soils keep oxidizing and blowing carbon into the atmosphere. And only maybe 1930 or 35 does the thing start to turn around. And still, even today, we're running a net deficit in terms of the carbon balance for the region that was really invoked when our great-great-great-grandparents, if we had great-great-great-grandparents in this region, their decisions about land. So this is an example of that really long-scale century legacy effect. There are also legacy effects in terms of pollution loads. And it's really interesting. I had a student who was very interested in the history of nutrients in the region and pollution in the region. And she made these really fabulous maps for 1920, 1960, and year 2000. And red means really high nitrogen pollution in these settings. And she was able to show how the system went from this Western New York dominated environment with lots of nitrogen pollution to this kind of bifurcation in kind of the middle Atlantic states and upper New York state to basically a Chesapeake Bay problem that's driven in some large measure by animal husbandry down here, and how just within an 80-year period you have this really interesting shifting mosaic of this chemistry on the landscape. We also have really interesting, and this was one of the benefits of assembling these interdisciplinary teams. I had really the honor of bringing together these dozen each year for 3 years, a dozen PhD students who we brought from around the country including historians, cultural studies experts, lawyers, economists, and ecologists and hydrologists. And one of the historians was really interested in the history of river impoundments in the Northeast. And he uncovered this really, in my view, really fabulous hydrology. I'm a hydrologist, fabulous hydrologic interaction with politics. And what evidently happened is during the Depression, you know the story about building up large reservoirs in the western part of the U.S. And the idea was to try to spread this to the entire nation. It was, in fact, trying to build ourselves out of the Depression. And when the federal government and FDR came knocking on the doors of many of the governors of the states in New England, they discovered that the plans, for example, in I guess this is the Connecticut River Valley, would be flooding lots of picturesque little towns. And unfortunately for the federal government, they were going to earmark Newfane, Vermont as one of the inundated sites for one of their big reservoir plans. And guess who grew up in Newfane, Vermont? The governor of Vermont. And so he said, over my dead body, you're going to do this. And he motivated several of the other governors to have a pushback against the federal government to put in these big flood control and hydroelectric facilities. And that's one reason why we don't have a lot in this region. Well, that was a sort of a political battle, interesting little story. But the interesting little story has a legacy effect. Well, we live in the Northeast. There are a lot of people. They need a lot of energy. If you're not going to be building hydroelectric facilities, what are you going to do? You're going to have to get your electricity somehow, and you do it through thermoelectric power generation. And in large measure in those days, it was through coal-fired power stations, okay? So we're building a lot of these kinds of plants instead of these kinds of plants in the Northeast. Okay, well, let me try to put this in some perspective. So one of the things that we've been opening dialogue with these decision makers on is on the issue of climate change. And it comes to some of them as a surprise that several of the simulation models that we see of the future of this particular region show that the region's getting wetter in the future. It's not doom and gloom, dry, bone dry skeletons in the desert for the Northeast. That's hardly the case. It's actually, if you believe what the models say, this is going to probably be a wetter region in the future, which of course opens up all sorts of possibilities. If this is a wetter part of the region and the Midwest or the far west is going to be much drier, well, what does that mean in terms of maybe reopening our croplands to agriculture, which were abandoned many decades ago? So these are the kinds of interesting questions that we have. But let me get back to this legacy effect of this political battle between the federal government and the states. So one of the things that we've been doing on this project is we've been simulating the impact of this thermoelectric power generation, and we have a population of 384 of these objects that we put on these maps, and we have simulation models that look at the heat loads of these particular installations. And even though it's going to potentially be a wetter part of the world in the future, it's also going to be a hotter part of the world. Can't escape the fact it's going to be warmer. And we can make these calculations and we see, and it may be difficult to see, but most of these rivers are lighting up pretty much red when you turn the power plants on, and that means that they're getting hotter in the future because of the combined effect of generating electricity in a hotter environment. And here we have, plant by plant what we see here. And if we don't have a clear understanding of what's happening, so kind of in the background level, in terms of the thermal pollution, and we think of the energy sector as kind of divorced from that question, we're not going to make much headway, and we could be banging ourselves over the head for many, many decades to come. The good news I have in all of this is you can begin to operate these plants in a future environment where if you start to turn the most offending thermally polluting plants on and off, you can find lots of interesting examples where reaches of river can generate more electricity because the pollution from the upstream offending power station gives room for additional electricity to be produced downstream, and you also protect the aquatic habitat at the same time. Okay, now, speaking of legacy effects, we have legal legacies as well. And has anyone used Ngram for kind of tracking the way words are used? You must have done this, Andy. I'm sure you've done this. So I did a little Ngram analysis. So this is trying to show the trending of words and phrases. And I put the phrase climate change in, and I put the words water pollution in. And if you put words water pollution in, you find, you look, I guess, through the corpus of English language books from 1950 to 2010 in both cases. You see that there's this very, very rapid rise starting, I guess, in the 60s. The environmental movement came to a head, in a sense, with the Clean Water Act, which was instituted in '72, and the Clean Air Act around that time as well. And it drops off precipitously. At the same time, we've got climate change just rising and rising and rising on everybody's minds. Well, what's kind of interesting about this is that the laws that are used to protect the environment, including thermal pollution laws, were constructed in the year 1972, or at least they were put into law in the year 1972, when we had hardly any mention of the word climate change. I guess the question is, how can we rely ultimately on 20th century laws in the era of climate change without really beginning to think that, hey, there's a different set of issues on the table, folks, and maybe we need to think this through a little bit more clearly. Now, kind of as I got two slides here. Last slide is, I guess, a plea for the right kinds of messaging. And we've heard from Mary the power of visual messages and experiential art as a way to engage people and have that discussion about what's going on. I ran a workshop a few years back for the National Research Council. I was the chair of one of their committees on hydrology. And we were challenged to ask the question about climate change and extreme hydrology. And the idea is that with climate change, you're going to get more extreme floods and more extreme droughts. And we assembled an interesting package of players. We brought together climatologists, we brought together water scientists, and we brought together practitioners like from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers or like from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, who actually have to make decisions with information that will be coming out of the science community. And what we discovered is that, yep, there was absolutely a consensus about the fact that we probably will see in the future more extreme climate-related water events. But what was very interesting to us as we kind of delved into this a bit is that there was a major disconnect between atmospheric scientists and hydrologists. They use very, very different kinds of terminology to assess how variable or how more intense the kinds of weather we might see would play itself out in just the science of it. The science of it was different. And then the two of them together, the climate scientists and the hydrologists, the water scientists, had a major disconnect between what kinds of important and useful information they could give, for example, to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that has a 30 or 40-year planning horizon for putting up levees or putting in reservoirs, or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which has about maybe a 40 to 50-year planning horizon. And it's precisely during those time frames that the signal-to-noise ratio, if you want to call it that, the climate signal, is not really so clear. And certainly the climate scientists and the hydrologic scientists couldn't give actionable information to the practitioners. So I think one of the important lessons that we learned from this is that you do need those very, very clear ways of communicating, not only across the sciences, but with the sciences and the scientists and the users. And okay, so this is my last slide here, and I hope I can get it to run. And I asked if we are masters of water management or bulls in the china shop. And I think if we do it right...
Picking and choosing them.
I didn't want that. They will recognize it. You know, it's funny, I really tried, this is an award-winning Merrill Lynch. I couldn't find a nice version of it. I could just find these really bitmapped, crude. But I think the image is what we really are talking about. And I hope I've made my point that we've kind of been like bulls in the china shop. I don't think this is necessarily the case in the future, but we really have to come together and have the very creative dialogues that we've heard certainly in the last talk as well on how we're going to tackle this. So I will end with that, and I guess I turn this over to Andy, right?
Maybe you'd like to take a seat and I'll turn the lights up.
Well, it's a great conclave of different approaches to the same questions. I want to just mention some broader contexts about how conversations of this sort are increasing. That it's very encouraging to me to see not just the arts and sciences, but the social sciences and the hard, quote unquote, hard sciences are convening more and more in ways that are vital, given that the big questions about things like climate change or how do you use water more sparingly on a crowding planet are mostly social. They're mostly about behavior, and they're also about technology. But how we make choices, whether they're political choices or personal choices, is all behavioral. And that, if you're not bringing in the scientists who study how we work and how we react, and what kinds of images capture our attention, what kinds of images make us recoil, what kinds of messages as well, then you could spend decades, as the IPCC has done, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, trying to convey basic science and have it just sort of wash off of people like water off of the back of a duck. And whether they're global leaders who really haven't pursued the kind of meaningful changes in emissions of greenhouse gases that scientists have said for decades are necessary to stabilize the climate system. So it's great to see what's happening here. Contextually, I'll just say I've been at 2 or 3 different meetings in the last few months to build it's a little too bright, a little too hot. Us musicians pay attention to that. I was at the Vatican a month and a half ago in the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, which frankly I didn't know existed until a couple of years ago, convened their second meeting together of social sciences, including economists and philosophers and climatologists and oceanographers and technologists. They came together at the Vatican for a meeting called Sustainable Planet, Sustainable Humanity, Our Choice. In other words, it was what we have to remember too is that in the end, the choices we make are mostly framed by our values, not by the data. Science delineates the playing field. It delineates, whether it's soccer, what game you're playing. It tells you the rules of the game, how greenhouse gases work. Like the legacy issue, the fact that there's persistence. Those are just facts about how the system works. But it's individuals and societies who actually decide whether to buy an efficient car or not, whether the politics allows for a restriction on a greenhouse gas that could raise the price of energy. Those are not science delineated questions. Science doesn't tell you what to do. It tells you what's going on. And that was really valuable. The Vatican, one of the most interesting, and then the Vatican meeting, I wrote like 4 or 5 different pieces about it. You can find them on my blog. Just search for Revkin and Vatican, which is kind of an odd conjunction. Seems I was bar mitzvah, I never went to Catholic school or anything. But there was the Nicaragua, a cardinal, Maradiaga from Nicaragua, who's a close associate of the new pope. He gave the opening speech, and he said that mankind is a technical giant and an ethical child. And that really resonated for me. We've developed all these potencies, these capacities to change landscapes, to harness rivers, to liberate carbon, turn a black rock into energy, and even the atom into energy. But we haven't yet demonstrated being able to do planning on long time scales think globally and act locally. Mostly, we still think and act with our national interests in mind. So it was great to see the things you've been doing in Boulder and elsewhere, where you're giving a new kind of visualization to problems that scientists know clearly, but that are especially the idea of conveying the rare, or conveying something that's rare in time or space. How you were able to do that with those blue symbols, and then also how other artists. Were you involved with any of the sea level rise projects, where similarly they've demarcated New York City's shoreline?
Mosher, I think.
Yeah, that's right. There's things that artists bring to this with the understanding that could come from social science and the data that come from the hard sciences. So how much of a shift have you seen in the crosstalk? I mean, you still said it's really hard to get funding and sort of a piece of that pie.
Well, it's a huge shift for me in, I'd say, the last decade, from kind of thinking that people could experience things like with the South Cove project, that you give people access to the water, you show them, and through their experience, they'll be able to take this scene in. And as time went on, I realized there was all of this content, this really specific content, that I felt needed to be communicated. So then I started talking to experts who knew about these things. And the challenge now that I think that I'm dealing with is how you communicate that, and not just become didactic and keep the kind of engagement that art can have, that kind of, that surprise. How can you not weigh yourself down with this content? And it's really an ongoing process of experimentation. Here I was really excited about this experience we had with the game designer. How could we develop, a kind of virtual exploration of the corridor of Broadway? Charles and I have had some really interesting conversations about quantifications and equivalencies, and how you could, those are things that are really engaging. Working with Robert Sullivan and, finding that language can pull people in a way that, so it's really this experiment that's just been intensifying as I've gone on. By the way, now that I've gotten closer to the science world, I mean, there's no comparison in the kinds of grants you can get, even though they're really hard to get, as we know. Like $50,000 is a lot of money for an art grant. And, here we have this, lucky enough to have gotten one NSF grant that's allowing a whole city to be imprinted with these 6 different sites.
And you were involved with that together, or not?
Yeah, we actually co-applied for a grant, and it's really quite tough to get.
We were up against ourselves.
Up against ourselves.
Indianapolis and Broadway.
Well, we had 2 proposals going at the same time. But it's getting tougher to really lay out these kinds of interdisciplinary ideas, and I would argue that the art science is kind of the quintessential interdisciplinary concept, and there are not many homes for that kind of support. Yeah. And at the end of the day, we've got to feed our graduate students and postdocs and ourselves, and there are just fewer and fewer venues. Even though there's a lot of talk about the need for this, if you really look under the hood of the funding car, there's not a lot there.
Yeah, and although there's a lot of capacity just through collaborative, through sort of like through having a Match.com for skill sets, that even within campuses, I teach at Pace University now, and what I'm trying to do there is build a collaborative culture across disciplines, so that if a scientist over here or a master's student in environmental science is trying to develop an animated visualization of data for a presentation, they have the ability to sort of get that query out to the world, like you could do on Kickstarter or whatever. I see a lot of untapped potential to get around the budget crunch by just literally saying, hey, using social networks or just convening somehow through campus means or other means to get the right skill set to the right part of that task. Is that happening at all?
Well, I think that's correct. I mean, certainly there are ad hoc ways in which you can connect people and connect ideas. But I guess it goes back to this idea of the percentage of projects that are go to the art. I mean, it does say something if it's 0.25% of a project that goes to the art. It means that society is valuing it in a particular way. The fact that society is not valuing these ideas in a tangible way, that you've got to actually bend over backwards and be super creative to get the kinds of social networks to operate. That's all ad hoc, and to some degree it's very voluntary. You know, even though you talk to program managers, for example, at NSF, and there is this concept of doing interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary research.
And also what they call broader outcomes.
Broader outcomes.
Any grant is supposed to have some percentage that's for something like that.
Yes, exactly. And I review lots of NSF proposals, and I see all sorts of kooky things with respect to the broader impacts. But yet there is this need to make sure that what you're doing is of relevance to society at large. And there is that, certainly there is that requirement at NSF in terms of these kinds of projects. But again, I think that the notion of truly bridging that science to visual arts or musical arts connection, I think there's a lot of talk about it, but there are very few really good examples of that. I've got a collaboration with a group called Vox Naturae that's coming out of Iceland. And they're very interested, as Icelanders might be, of the disappearing ice sheets and ice caps of the world. And they've been sending people out into the field, basically recording soundscapes, the sounds of the changing glaciers. And they're going to be constructing a major event, I guess it's going to be the next year or two, to take up basically a group of people out to the base of a glacier, and through the smoke and mirrors of modern visualization, they're going to make that glacier disappear.
That's interesting.
And they're going to have music going with it, and the sounds of the glaciers accelerated. And it's really going to make it disappear using holographic techniques and things like this. I could not imagine a more interesting awareness building event that would really drive home what will that place look like in 100 years as the ice disappears, and now you've got greenery in the midst of what used to have as just solid sheet of ice. But again, this is coming out of the art world as opposed to the science world. And I think that it's this co-balance between the scientific rigor and artistic engagement. And that's why I enjoyed so much our dialogue together, because there really is that co-balance. And you got to get that right, because otherwise it's just an add-on.
Right. Have you been involved in any projects where you're facilitating, one of you mentioned this earlier, I can't remember, the crowd doing some of the art. I'll give you an example. Up the river where I live in the Hudson Valley, there's a program called River of Words, where a poet, and my wife was involved with it for a while, she's an environmental educator, where they'll do classroom workshops, they'll go out into the woods, the kids will make observations, they're science-based, but then they go back and write poetry. And so this is like another layer. Yeah. It's not about just communicating to the policy, voters. It's about getting kids or people actively thinking about nature in a scientific way, and then going back and using the other muscles in your brain to be creative about it. Has that been out there?
I think that when I talk about the events or the multiple access points to this information, I think we're realizing that kind of thing is so important to have happening. Okay, we've got this great app, Track a Raindrop. Hey,
right.
Only the water, guys want to use it or look at it. How do you really begin to engage people with that? And so I think we've really come to see it. There's no matter what I put out on the street, it by itself, is not good enough. It's really, giving these different means of accessing and having ongoing over a period of time. We did a first NSF, small NSF project testing this Broadway initiative of turning Broadway into the green corridor of New York City. And one of the things we saw as they did this very rigorous assessment is that over time, you know, more and more people got this. But I'm just really interested in, one of the reasons I'm looking at Broadway is how do you take these issues that are in Plan YC, for instance, and get them down on the street and get people engaged. I think as much as you have to keep working with the decision makers until you can get, you know, enough people to be noticing, to have the word climate change or hydrology or water appear, you know, it's got to happen. You know, it's really, I feel so strongly that that's got to be going from both directions.
I want to ask you both if there are projects you've seen, separate from the work you've done yourselves, like in Indianapolis, that really excite you along these lines, somewhere else, either in the world or in the country. I'll give you a couple of quick examples from my experience. One is Mannahatta, this 400-year examination using data of what the ecology was of Chelsea or Canal Street. You know, what was actually there 400 years ago, just before Western civilization took hold here in a big way. And it's so fascinating. The visualizations that were done for that project were amazing. And then I was in South Korea. In 2009, I did an article for the New York Times on the restoration of a stream that had flowed, that was really why the city of Seoul exists. This little stream was the reason people congregated there. But over centuries, it got forgotten and paved over. And a certain mayor, who ended up becoming South Korea's second most recent president, Lee Moon-bak, when he was mayor of Seoul, he said he saw the traffic tangle and the pollution, and he said, we're going to strip out all this asphalt and we're going to restore the Chungichan. And they did it, and it's this remarkable ribbon of green. It's cooled the temperatures there. They incorporated it into a new plan for bus lanes and stuff, and it's become this haven in this very built-up city. What that took was incredible, a real powerful leader. You know, his nickname was Bulldozer. But he also, so he was powerful. But they had something like 200 different community meetings to sort of pave the way for this.
Is that all?
Yeah, that was a lot. I mean, that was a lot. It struck me as a lot.
Hey, you don't know what the public realm is.
No, in New York City, it's probably worse. But anyway, I don't know. So what's out there that's really excited you? That's already been out and around.
Well, actually, as you probably detected from my talk, I like to think at the broadest of scales, because I think that we do have our perceptions kind of conditioned by our experiences. You know, so as a New Yorker, for example, we talked about this. It's hard to think of where stuff comes from. You know, we sort of, you know, we're on the street, and guess what? Beyond New Jersey is not the great other world. There's stuff happening that's of importance to us because we get our food from across the Hudson, let's say, and our energy comes from other places, and we are very, very dependent on what we term the ecosystem services. I think you call them the lifelines. That was the very word that you used, the lifelines to other parts of the planet that will allow us to live and enjoy life as New Yorkers. And I think that perception is not, I mean, New Yorkers get blamed for that kind of balkanized view, but it's in many other places. I think urban people in general have that concept. And to be talking about issues much more broadly, like the ecological footprint of the Earth, that we need 1.4 Earths to right now and more to come in order to keep the planet going. How are we going to do this in a sustainable way? We may be hitting these boundaries on what the Earth can take as a body block from humanity. So I like to think about these kind of global images that people are working on now, and to try to translate that down to maybe the local scale of perception, that, you know, if we're hitting a boundary at the planetary scale, what better place than a city to talk about that? How many tons of wheat will we be able to grow in Central Park? I doubt we will be growing very much wheat. So, you know, if our boundary is simply New York City and the 5 boroughs, I don't know how many other New York City areas we will need. We might need 5,000 New York City areas to just feed ourselves. And so I think those kinds of concepts are very powerful if we can bridge that gap between what's happening globally and what's happening kind of in our backyards.
That's true. Anything come to mind? By the way, time for questions from you too, so.
You know, if I think of things that have been moving to me, I've traveled in India a lot, and to see the ways that people within like totally chaotic, crazy urban environments will take something like a tree and, celebrate it. I find those situations so moving, and it's what's really inspired me to have hope that within the chaos of New York City, I go to DOT and say, I want to do this project up Broadway, and they say, you're crazy, this is impossible, Broadway's already this, madhouse. But I really think you can just do these very modest interventions that are so magnetic that you can't ignore them. Then I speaking of Robert Sullivan again, a writer who, if he's writing about the Meadowlands, for instance, can put you there and get you considering that place in so many different ways. I just find so moving. And Eric's study, Mannahatta, I've been obsessing about his Muir web diagram for several years now, and it's kind of forming the basis of my the iconography of my Indianapolis project. So, there are just, and I'm still, we had this extended discussion about ecosystem services, and I'm saying, how can we make people understand that? And so we came up with the term lifelines, but I would love to imagine doing just a project in itself that was about these connections, these tentacles, that we all have to the world, not just the, region, but the world. And I find it almost impossible. And I think one of the things that's, very difficult with this is I come in as an artist with no language of the sciences, and it's like sometimes we're talking like this. Misunderstandings can occur very easily. And so you have this time of taking this content in, but then how do you get people to really begin to make these connections in some direct way that have taken you some time, as I'm average Jane on the street, I'm not, and I kind of want to preserve my Jane on the street role because I want to make things accessible to, pretty much anybody on the street. But how do you do that? How do you talk about atmosphere? And how do you convey these very complex issues?
There are some wonderful examples. There's a British science illustrator named Adam Neiman. I don't know if you know his work. He's done these visualizations of
Like
a day's worth of CO2 emissions from London.
Spheres.
What a big size that is. And all kinds of interesting, especially animating the data gives you so many more dimensions, literally, to you get people thinking about time and space in different ways. It's really, there is a lot of experimentation. And I do think social media or things, the cell phone, my son really likes mango juice. This Luza mango juice comes in those sort of glass bottles like this. And one day I was musing with him, where did this come from? And I looked at it, and it's from Belgium. So you start to think, okay, so this mango juice in New York is from Belgium. Pause. How did that happen? Where did the mangoes come from? How did the juice get to Belgium? And so if you can find ways using a smartphone or something, you have an app to just instantly get that information flowing to people, then you can build these lifelines out. I love the idea of lifelines generally, but just using the data that's out there.
Technology is so, the things that it can do is,
But somehow retaining a connection to the real world at the same time, that's that challenge.
And for me, that's the thing. I'm really absolutely determined to make it place-based, real time, real space, not just on the screen, not just in the hand, but I want you to see it and feel it right there.
So there must be questions out there, right here, and then over here.
I'm still struck by what you're saying about the funding and it sounds like, what you get money from the National Science Foundation, although maybe not as much, but then Mary's saying that you know, these engineering projects, and so, oh, there's some little component that's about art or outreach or communications in those. And I actually work on climate change issues with the UN, so I'm bombarded constantly with the scientific information, and I write very boring reports that no one reads. So I'm really struggling with all this information about, you know, basically, say there's a 10-year window in which, you know, we really have to change the energy system. Otherwise, we're perhaps already at the tipping point beyond which, you know, we're on a trajectory to have an uninhabitable planet for us. Other things will survive, but, you know, the way we imagine, you know, this lifestyle won't be sustainable because of the droughts, food production, flooding, loss of glaciers, acidification of the oceans, loss of biodiversity, loss of the bees, everything. And it sounds like there, to me, you know, there's got to be more urgency with scientists. That's a real responsibility. That, I mean, I've been in the climate change conferences. The U.S. has a pavilion. On one side, the NASA scientists are showing tremendous high-definition, dire projections and photographs about droughts and destruction of the planet. The other side are the politicians from the United States who are saying, we don't believe in this talk, we don't need to have an agreement, we're not going to do that. We're just going to do voluntary things, working with the private sector, or things that they're willing to do. And we're not really going to engage with it. And it seems to me that, you know, there's got to be some other way of talking about this, because clearly people not only don't listen to the science, you got half the country who say they don't believe any of it and it's a hoax. And I think that there's some responsibility, you know, within the scientific community to not just say, well, this is how science works and there's no certainty. And that this importance of trying to connect with people on the street to show what this will mean, to convey this, is so urgent that it needs to be addressed in a different way. Even though it's very disturbing that even like Amy's job, you know, there's not the coverage in, you know, the New York Times, there's not the journalism, there's plenty of social media, but this information is, you know, this is a very small group here, probably people who are very specialized interests in this. And I guess what I'm saying is that, you know, I'd love to have there be a stronger flow of this information and energy to try to, you know, to move both the public and the politicians, because it's really an urgent problem. And it's people who work on it tend to sort of set back now in despair because it's just too much, you know, and you know, not a lot of progress.
So, Charles, you've been at the interface of science and policy in many ways for a long time. I assume you've been an IPCC author at some point.
No, I specifically avoided that.
Oh, you did?
Responsibility.
Okay. But you know, so what's your take on the adequacy of the scientist as communicator, or the science community as communicator?
This is a really interesting question. Well, obviously we've been trying, and I think we've got a wonderful person here who's been trying for quite a long time to get the message out. But, you know, I think that there are powers to be that are hell-bent against any change. And I think that when I grew up as a child, scientists were, you know, the sine qua non of humanity, right? I mean, really, to be a scientist was to be with someone really special. Now, I'm part of a community that's been vilified in some sense and thought of as having some kind of underhanded agenda that we're not revealing, and we're getting rich on all this grant money or whatever from the climate change research establishment. But I always say that if you tell me,
Well, Al Gore's getting rich.
that, well, he got rich.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, you know, if you were to tell me what someone does and for a living, who they're representing, and I could tell you with 0.99, 99% accuracy, how they're gonna stand on the climate change question. I've done this with my class. We go through lists of people, and sure enough, you can read how these entrenched interests that are really, you know, they don't want to have to deal with the change because they look at it as a bottom line kind of question. Now, you know, so my thought is on this is that the real way to engage the set of questions is by looking at it from an economic perspective, that we need to really begin to talk about. For example, you start to destroy the ecosystem services. Let's say with climate change, you see more drought, less water coming out of the Earth system. Well, you need the water to cool your power stations, right? Well, if you don't have water to cool your power stations, guess what? You gotta import your energy from somewhere else. Guess what? It costs more. Guess what? People will become unemployed because some of the sectors in your economy are going to have to shut down. So I think it's that kind of economic, you've gotta meet it on its own terms. These are economic, whether stated or not, these are economic pushbacks to the science, I believe, at their very heart. And I think we've got to push back in the other direction by saying, look, there's an economic price to be paid about this. And it's going to be a fight. I'm sure it's going to be a fight. But otherwise, I think, you know, we just sit here and try our best and we become vilified over time. It doesn't really push the ball forward.
Well, I guess I could pose a question for the New York Times. Now, as you know, there's a big crisis in Iraq. The area that is now occupied by the Sunni are on the Tigris-Euphrates River. Is there an article about the Tigris-Euphrates River and the drought and the problems with the Tigris-Euphrates River and the fact that there's an opportunity with the terrorists to have a comprehensive river management program pursuant to U.S. State Department practices of river exchange? In other words, what I find very wrong has been the continuation, the sectorization of knowledge. Yeah. Global politics, science.
I can address that directly,
And there really needs to be much more. Tigris-Euphrates, well, there's a lot of ecological problems there, and we have an article about that, and maybe the coincidence of the rebels with that region as a watershed.
Tom Friedman did something similar not long ago and focused on Syria, where same drought, same issues.
Right.
And I've written periodically about that water, the water sharing issues in that part of the world. What doesn't happen at the New York Times, and it's because the Times is like the rest of us, it's compartmentalized.
Right.
Back in like 2003, 2002, the Times was doing a big series, global series on water. But it was mostly power, it was about politics and economics, and there wasn't, I was supposed to do the piece that was this component about climate change and how it's going to affect everything, basically, that all these other pieces were about. But it got whittled down to ending up to being like a sidebar, a 500-word piece, because the editors in charge of this whole operation were foreign. They were the foreign editors of the foreign correspondence, so it was a foreign desk story. It wasn't a science story. So you end up with the same kind of battles for how this plays out. And I can tell you other examples where we did a series on the depopulation of the Great Plains. It was a great series. Came out, this was again maybe 8 or 10 years ago, 10 years ago. It came out, and the science desk where I was working didn't even know about it. So it was a multi-part series on the sort of all these towns and, you know, the economics and Dakotas are losing their populations. And there was nothing in it about rewilding of the Great Plains ecosystem, the bison prairie dog system, and how that's responded. There was nothing about the environmental context of all this, because the editors who were commissioning it were in their fiefdom, just like you have economics and science. And
So how do we address that? I mean,
well, you try to break down the walls. I mean, and it's really hard. And I found in my experience, both in journalism and now in academia, increasingly the best way to do it is a very subversive way, where you just kind of partner up. You find like-minded people and you just do stuff, and it comes out one way or another. The idea that you're going to get an official kind of revamping of academia, the department structure of academia. People everywhere are trying to do this, but I think it's hard.
I had an experience, actually. I had an experience with one of these students who was a historian who worked on our project, who at great personal peril took on the task of writing a paper with 14 other co-authors on this hydrology question for the colonial period. And it's completely antithetical to the reward system in historical scholarship. Those folks get the accolades by writing a treatise, a monograph or two on a particular subject, single authored. And to be engaged in team-based research is very devalued in that arena. And in order to really be talking across these disciplines, the reward system, the whole structure of academia in some sense has to be revamped, and I'm not sure it's happening quick enough.
It's true, yeah.
So I just want to say, as we hear the strains of music filling the room and we're moving this evening, the security staff has told me that they have to close the building in 15 minutes.
All right.
So can we answer?
Yeah, so I've heard the words liberated carbon 5 or 6 times now. I may as well sing the song. I wrote this maybe 8 or 10 years ago. I just put it on an album. I have my first album out this past year. And I play upside down, so don't get distracted by that. It's a three-minute history of fossil fuels. It took 1,000 generations for our species to rise, but gathering and hunting was no way to get by. We yearned to burn more than dung and sticks. Someone came along and said, hey, try lighting this. We opened up the ground and took out coal and oil. Started liberating carbon and it made our blood boil. Liberated carbon, it'll spin your wheels. Liberated carbon, it'll make your meals. Liberated carbon, it'll turn your night to day. Hey, hey, come on and liberate some carbon, babe. It's an American way and the Chinese way. Now I got peat swamp fossils running my teeth.